The collapse of the Atlantic cod. 500 years. That's how long cod had been sustaining life on Canada's eastern coast. But on July 2, 1992, that era ended in a single press conference. Minister John Crosbie announced a total moratorium on northern cod fishing. The fishery was closed. Not for a season. Not for 5 years. Indefinitely. The number that killed it, 1%. Northern cod stocks had fallen to just 1% of their historic levels. 1%. By the time anyone admitted the ocean was empty, it was far too late. For 5 centuries, Newfoundland fishermen had worked the Grand Banks, the richest fishing grounds in the world. They used hand lines, nets, and boats that respected limits. The cod came back. The system worked. Then, in the 1950s, everything changed. The technology arrived quietly. Radar. Electronic navigation. Sonar. Massive trawlers, floating factories that could fish deeper, wider, and longer than anything that came before. By the 1960s, Canadian catches were exploding. The peak came in 1977, 810,000 metric tons of cod landed in a single year. The money poured in. The boats got bigger. The crews got larger. Entire towns in Newfoundland became entirely dependent on the fishery. In some villages, fisheries made up 40% of the entire local economy. This wasn't just a job, it was identity, culture, survival. But the fish couldn't keep up. Here's what the data actually showed, and here's where it gets darker. By the mid-1980s, independent scientists were warning that catch rates were collapsing. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans knew the numbers weren't adding up. The average size of fish being caught was shrinking. Younger and younger fish were being pulled from the water. In 1989, fisheries scientist George Rose published research showing the cod population was in free fall. He was ignored. The moratorium didn't come until 1992. That's a 3-year gap. 3 years of knowing and doing nothing. Why? Follow the incentives. The federal government had other priorities. The fishery represented jobs, political power, and votes in Atlantic Canada. Closing the fishery meant admitting failure. It meant economic catastrophe for thousands of families. Ministers faced enormous political pressure to keep the boats working, the catches coming, and the paychecks flowing. The Department of Fisheries also had a structural problem: they weren't ecologists. They were counting fish the wrong way. Cod stock estimates were based on sampling and environmental variables, ocean temperature, currents, breeding patterns, that they didn't fully understand. When the numbers looked uncertain, the government chose the optimistic interpretation. Year after year, they set catch quotas higher than the science supported because admitting the truth would have required shutting everything down. The technology companies had no incentive to stop selling better equipment. The boat owners had no incentive to fish less. The government had no incentive to enforce limits. So nobody did anything until the ocean made the decision for them. But here's what the headlines missed: the trawlers weren't just catching cod. They were catching capelin, an essential prey species for cod. They were catching juvenile fish. They were catching species that predators depended on. The bycatch was enormous, hundreds of thousands of tons of fish that got dumped back into the ocean, dead. The trawlers didn't just deplete a fishery. They destabilized an entire ecosystem. And the Canadian government knew this was happening. Their own researchers documented the ecological destruction. But the metrics that mattered, the ones in budget reports and harvest tables, didn't measure ecosystem health. They measured tons landed and revenue generated. So the ecosystem collapsed invisibly, hidden inside a system that was only designed to see what it wanted to see. The moratorium was declared in 1992. 30 years later, the cod still haven't returned. The fishery remains closed. Tens of thousands of people lost their livelihoods. Entire communities economically collapsed. Some towns haven't recovered. This is the operating model of extraction: take everything you can until the system breaks, because the people running it aren't the ones who pay the price when it does. The technology wasn't the problem. The fish populations weren't the problem. The problem was a system where short-term profit and political expediency were the only metrics that mattered, where measuring what you're destroying required admitting the structure was unsustainable. It happened in Newfoundland in 1992. It's happening right now with aquifers in the American West, rainforests in Brazil, and fish stocks in the South China Sea. The only thing that changes is the commodity. This video is for educational purposes only.